All right, so Brian, want to kick things off by telling us a little bit about New Age Meats beyond what Alexandra just mentioned?
Definitely, yeah. And we have some slides. So this is Jessie, right? We're looking at, no, there, okay. So Jessie is a pig, as you can see, and she is from a farm in Marin, which is just north of San Francisco, across the Golden Gate Bridge. So last July, we visited Jessie and we took a little biopsy, about that big, and she runs off to the farmyard, and we come back to our labs at IndieBio, where we were at the time, and we take those cells, and they're stem cells, and we separate those out, and you start to grow and multiply them. You put them in a nutrient-rich broth, and that makes them proliferate and divide, as you probably learned in biology class. And at some point, you have a bunch of stem cells, and you separate them, and then you induce them to muscle and to fat. Mm-hmm. And so then we put them together, and we make these pork sausages. So these are those sausages that we made, not just a stock photo. This is in September. We had a tasting. We had about 40 people that came and tried them and said some nice things about them. They tasted really good. In fact, when I tasted it the first time, the week before, it was basically a mix of muscle and fat, and cooked it up, and I tasted it, and I'm like, well, it tastes like bacon. Like, that's it. It's just pork muscle, pork fat. So in a sense, it was almost like, well, that's it. Like I was expecting something like grand and amazing. It's just like, oh, it's just like the bacon you can buy down the store. So there is the event. And myself, my co-founder you see behind us, part of our team. We had the event at a brewery, which we'll chat about in a second. But that's kind of the background, Alex.
Cool, thank you. So I've been talking to a lot of people while I've been walking around DLD, and the people say kind of half jokingly, like, are you guys catering this event? So 2 questions. 1, are you catering DLD? And 2, on a bigger picture, tell us about the state of the industry right now. What's happening in cell-based meat as a whole around the world? Sure.
I get the impression that DLD has a pretty good budget, but they probably couldn't afford to have us cater it. It's still extremely expensive. So these sausages, the ones that you saw there, they're about $2,500 or $3,000 each when we made them. So the price has come down quite a bit. So they're about, in our case, it's about $190 per sausage, and it's a 100-gram sausage that we're making. So the price is still declining, and we'll talk about why that is in a second. What was your second question?
What is going on in the cell-based meat industry in general right now? So give us a bit of a high-level overview.
Yeah, sure. So there are probably about, I would say, 150 people in private industry working in this, and that's spread between about 25 companies. So about 6 of those companies are in the San Francisco Bay Area, where we are located. There's another one in Southern California. There are 3 in Europe, another 3 in Israel, Japan, Singapore, and maybe one in China. And there are a few others popping up. I know a few in Canada and such that are wanting to get started. So none of the companies right now are to market. There is at least one that says they're going to be serving a chicken nugget very soon in a restaurant in Asia. But as of yet, we're all still developing the product and dropping the cost down and developing the scaling infrastructure.
So around that cost, could you dive in a little bit more? I think it was around 8 years ago, out of Wageningen in the Netherlands, Mark Post had the first publicized lab-grown hamburger for about $330,000. Tell us about the progression of that and kind of the challenges with cost.
Sure. Yeah, so that was expensive. It's slightly more than the sausages that we made, and they made it in this very kind of old school way, a bunch of flasks and taking individual muscle fibers out and putting them between electrodes and exercising them. So it was extremely expensive endeavor. We've been able to drop that cost quite a bit. So from that time until I would say about 3 years ago, most of the companies were kind of the very intense, like either companies or they're more in this academic space. I would say probably about 3 years ago is when companies like really started to focus on making the product and putting it out. So we came together, I would say about a year and a half ago, November 2017, to work on this.
Okay, and going a little bit around the drivers of the cost. What are the challenges that you guys are facing?
Yeah, so you may have heard of, so for instance, fetal bovine serum would be one of the elements of, I see some heads nodding there. So fetal bovine serum is every bit as bad as it sounds, quite frankly. It is the fluid of a placenta that's extracted from a pregnant cow. right? And you pull that out because it has a bunch of nutrients in it. Has a bunch of growth factors, amino acids, and other nutrients that a cell would like. And so when you pull that out, that you then put that's one of the nutrient broths that you can put your cells in. So that's expensive. That's about €1,000 per liter. One of the reasons that we're trying to, or one of the challenges there is to replicate that FBS without using the placental fluid of a pregnant cow, right? So we need to understand what's in there, and then how you get those proteins that are in that FBS, extract them from another system that doesn't use the pregnant cows, and then be able to use that in a nutrient broth that's essentially less, there'll be fewer growth factors in there, and just the ones that are needed to proliferate and then to induce them. So those are some of the cost elements. Another one will be the scaling. So we have been able to make it in smaller reactors, and so as we scale up to like reactor size, there are still some processes that haven't yet been created or standardized on a larger scale, right? So we have like scales of around this big, but we're going to need scales much bigger in order to feed a growing and hungry planet. So those are some of the challenges that we're facing.
When it comes to scaling, it's kind of a timely panel because we are right after one around pharma. And pharma has been actually growing proteins for the last roughly 2 decades to make antibodies and biologics for mostly oncology. What has been the parallels between lab-grown meat and these drugs made in the lab, and have there been learnings that have gone across industries?
Definitely, yeah. So that's kind of one of the challenges we have also in recruiting, where we're recruiting people that have a promising career in pharma and saying like, hey, can you come over here and work with us in this cell-cultured meat technology? So the interesting thing about like a biologic or something that you would make at scale in a pharma process is a lot of what you're making there, the product is a derivative from the cell. So the cell is going to be secreting a protein, an antibody or something like that. In our case, we're eating the actual cell, right? So we're growing the cell out, and then we then harvest the cell, and then we change them to muscle and fat, and then we eat that. So it's a very different process. It has different goals. Instead of you want to increase density very rapidly, instead of like keeping density at a certain level and then increasing production rapidly. So there are definite overlaps, but then we're going very quickly in a new direction. That's kind of like this in between pharma and food science. So we have like all this area here that's us, that's kind of new and unexplored and really exciting. Really cool.
So compared to pharma, which is extremely regulated, the FDA in the EU, there's a different process. In Israel, there's another, same in Asia. What have you been learning around regulation? What's happening right now, both in the USA, in Europe, and beyond, that's affecting how you guys are looking at markets and actually getting into the market?
Yeah, so we're a US-based company, and we actually started life as a European-based company. We started in London, and we looked at the regulatory framework in, for instance, Europe and the United States. The United States, for all of its downsides in the regulatory front, is a little more, well, it focuses more on innocent until proven guilty, if you will. So if we're going to make a new food product or new technology, we can put it out there and have the public try it as long as it's not unsafe, and that you find that out essentially if there is some sort of incident, right? So whereas in Europe there is a longer pipeline to get it in the market in the first place. So in our case, we have kind of a patchwork between the FDA and the USDA, so the Food and Drug Administration and the US Department of Agriculture. And there is right now, for instance, the FDA manages everything upstream. This is in existing animal agriculture. So the FDA manages everything upstream, which would be the food, food and the drugs that go into the animals. And then the USDA manages the slaughter and the processing of the meat. And then if you take that meat and put it into a finished product, then the FDA would come in again. So that's the existing system. And we are now, the FDA and the USDA have had several joint meetings. So there was an FDA meeting in July. There was a USDA-FDA joint meeting in October. And very quickly after that meeting, they sent out a joint statement saying it's been essentially at a high level explaining what the regulatory framework would be. So, and it's very similar. So the FDA will be managing the cell banking, the cell growth. The FDA will, I said the FDA, yeah. So the USDA then will be managing the cell harvesting and production of raw meat. and then the FDA, again, will come in later. So it's a very similar system.
So going back to the safety side, talking about how the FDA looks at proving it's not unsafe. What is happening within the production process to actually look at safety and ensure good practices inside the company?
Yeah, that's if we look at polling data, for instance, on why people would or wouldn't try cell culture meat. So one of them is like, do I know that it's healthy and do I know it's safe? And we take that very seriously. So we have, for instance, toxicology that we look at. There are thresholds of certain chemicals that you can have in meat. So right now, for instance, even in the meat that you will go and buy, there are antibiotics in there. There are growth hormones in there from existing slaughtered animals, and there's a threshold level at which they can exist, and then you just test that. So in our case, we're taking a very proactive approach, and we're having toxicologists now take a look at our prototype sausage and understanding what would be any factors in there. So and this is at the prototype stage, but then additionally in the scale-up phase, like at scale, we're going to be having like giant reactors, and the USDA will be involved in our case, coming in and monitoring that. So they'll be taking ongoing analysis of all those factors that could be detrimental, and so we keep those at very low levels.
Okay, so to switch gears a little bit to the more macro level to compare it versus today's industry, one of the big challenges right now is around climate change and animal agriculture and its connection to greenhouse gas emission, land usage. What is the comparables within this? If you guys were to be looking to replace meat, what happens to the climate change aspect of meat production?
Right. So there are a few good life cycle analyses that have been done comparing industrial animal agriculture as it exists now with our industry. And so, for instance, if you take a look at the first item, which would be like land use, we will be using 99% less land. And that's not hard to believe because currently animal agriculture takes about 1/3 of the Earth's arable land that is not covered by ice. So your cows that graze and then the grain that goes to feed your animals covers about 1/3 of the agricultural land. So it's really hard for us not to be better than that. And in fact, we're about 99% less than that. So as far as the greenhouse gas emissions as well, we're about 98%. So that's because we don't create methane, which is extremely potent greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide as well from manure. We don't have manure. So across the board, much less. Water we'll use about 96%, and energy usage, that we use about 45% to 65% less. And that depends on the animal, right? So whether it's like a warm-blooded animal or whether it's a cold-blooded, like a fish or seafood, that varies depending on your energy requirement. So it'll be, in all cases, less, but it varies.
So talking about the different animals, you mentioned there's companies, and Alexandra mentioned as well, doing pork, beef, bluefin tuna, chicken, duck. I think I'm catching all of them now. There's also all the plant-based food companies, Impossible Foods, Beyond Meat, that are using just plants to replicate and taste like meat. Why all the work into making what's already out there? I'm curious, what is the kind of white space with cell-based meat? What can you guys what is the leverage you have to create new things or change things up, and why go after what's already actually readily available?
Right, it's a really good question. So when we came together and started working in November 2017, like I said, we started in London. We're an accelerator there called Entrepreneur First, if anybody's heard of that. And we had several late nights working on the science side. So I'm an engineer, chemical engineer, and then research and production automation. My co-founder is a PhD in tissue engineering, stem cell research, and we were specking out kind of like the biology and the engineering aspects and doing spreadsheets on this. And I remember one point is just looking at it like, this is hard. This is really hard to go and do this. Like technologically, it's extremely difficult. So we start to ask, well, why are we making the exact same thing that's already out there, right? Why don't we make something entirely new? Why don't we make something that's tastier, that's cheaper, that's more sustainable? So the question then is, well, would people eat it? If we come out with this new meat, like, hey, here's new meat, eat it, will people look at this new meat and say, what is this Franken meat? What is this thing that you've made? And so it's worth asking why we eat the meat we eat. Like, why is it that pork is really popular here? Like, why in the United States do we eat a lot of turkey? Why in India do we eat a lot of goat, right? So a lot of why we eat what we eat is very culturally derived. It comes from the stories that have been told us from our parents. It's part of the entire culture, right? And so when we look at what we can make, we also want to tell a story, right? So I told a story earlier about Jesse, about how the cells came from. There was as you saw there was our tasting was at a brewery, like a beer brewery, and there are big giant reactors behind us. So these reactors, big steel rivets, gauges, that type of engineering is what creates beer, and we're very comfortable with beer. And so it's for us, it's a story about where our pork product will come from. It's going to come from a reactor very much like that. So it makes people comfortable with that. So the exciting thing about what we can do is we can kind of start with our perception of food. We can say, like, why do we perceive food as being exceptionally delicious? Like, what is it about that? And we can control that environment to make that cell. There's only so much you can manipulate an animal to give you a different type of taste or a different type of texture. But we control the environment that the cell is in. We control all the amino acids and fatty acids and vitamins and minerals that go into the cell, and then with the products that come out of the cell. And so we can make that taste really amazing. Like you think of the pigs in the Iberian Peninsula, like the jamón ibérico, they romp around in the forest, in the oak forest, like eating acorns, and then they digest the acorns, and then that's available then to their cells. And then you can profile those cells and see why they taste that way. And we can go do that as well. And we could also go a step further and we can say, well, what would be like amazingly delicious? We can go meet with chefs and say, what is it that you want to do in the kitchen that's actually really hard to do? What are the spices or the taste that you could make? Like, what if you could have this perfect mix of umami and bitter and salty and sweet, and you could come together? Like, what if you were able to make a piece of meat and all the taste was actually in the cells itself and you didn't add any outside spices? So we're in this new and exciting future of I would say a new age of meats. Like, it's really cool. I just threw that in there.
So last question, we'll try and get to one audience question if there's anything burning. What do you see in the next 5 to 10 years? What does the future look like for you guys?
Right, so we personally will be in restaurants in the next 2 years. And there are other companies that are kind of going that route as well. So it is a more expensive product for all the things that I said in the beginning, but the cost rapidly will be dropping. So at some point in the future, we will be in grocery stores, so I say in the 5 to 10 years, and we're going to be then cheaper than existing conventional meat. At some point, you'll take a look at conventional meat, and you'll say, like, wow, that meat from a dead animal sure is expensive. I'll just stick with the cell culture meat. It tastes better anyway. It's healthier, so that's the future for us.
Okay, cool. Any questions up front?
Yeah, thanks so much, Brian.
Sure.
Fascinating talk. Do you see potential for a domestication of meat production in the future, where some of these technologies might come into the home, whereas rather than growing your houseplants, you might actually be growing your meat for your family?
That's a great question. Yeah, we chat about that. We've modeled out the idea of small size reactors. So in the beginning, we need to take advantage of economies of scale, right? So we need to have a supply chain. If we look at the cost of what we produce, in the beginning, it makes more sense to do it in a large environment. Now, as those costs drop, then we're going to be able to go smaller again. So there's no reason that you wouldn't have, instead of a bread maker or a coffee maker, you'd have your meat maker there. Yes. Short answer is yes.
One more in the back.
How is big agriculture fighting back?
Great question. So some of big agriculture is fighting back. Some of big agriculture is joining us. And that's really encouraging. If you look at, in the United States, there's Tyson and Cargill, there's the PHW Group, and then here, and Bell Food Group in Switzerland as well, have all invested in our technology. Not our technology, but our industry's technology. And that's because a lot of them see themselves as a protein company and not an animal company, right? So in their cases, they're not saying that the meat or protein comes from an animal, but rather protein can be created and that we're a protein company. And so Tom Hayes, who's the former CEO of Tyson, said, if we can create meat without animals, why would we kill an animal? And so a lot of them are not fighting back, but then some of them that are kind of on the outside of the investment, or that aren't going to invest in us, some of them are fighting back. And so we are far more encouraged by the amount that are with us than against us. So that's exciting.
Well, I think we're getting kicked off stage now. Thank you guys. If you have any questions, come grab us. But yeah, thank you.